Would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Milton Friedman?
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm glad to be here tonight. I must say I am strongly tempted, after the title, What's Wrong with the Welfare State with a question mark, to say nothing and turn around and walk off the stage. That would make it easier on all of us. But I learned long ago that it was good policy to be honest. What I want to talk about tonight are, first of all, the origins of the welfare state, and second of all, why it is that the noble objectives which have animated the growth of the welfare state have produced results that disappoint almost everybody, regardless of whether they were initially in favor or initially opposed to the various measures. And finally, ask ourselves, what, if anything, is the alternative to it, and what can we do about it? As to the origins of the welfare state, they go a long way back. There was a book which was published quite a long time ago by a man by the name of Cecil Driver called Tory Radicals. And it referred to a group of people in Great Britain in the early part of the 19th century, 150 and more years ago. William Osler, Lord Shaftesbury, these were a group of people from the upper classes of the British aristocracy who were very much concerned about the welfare of the ordinary people, of the lower classes, and who became the driving force behind a whole series of legislation, the so-called Factory Acts, the first 12-hour day and then 10-hour day act, and so on, which they promoted from a point of view of noblesse oblige. Their whole attitude was, after all, some people know better than other people what's good for people. We are among the elite. We know what's good for the ordinary man. We don't want to force it down his throat, but we believe that in a properly structured society, he would recognize that we do know better and would assign to us the task of structuring things for his benefit. That was a notion which the Tory radicals had at that time. And it is in many ways the basic motivating force on a moral and ethical level behind the movement for the welfare state. The closest modern descendant of that movement is John Kenneth Galbraith, who is also a Tory radical today. He and those who share his views, again, believe themselves to be an elite who know what is good for the ordinary man, who again do not wish to impose their views on the ordinary man, but who believe that the ordinary men too ought to recognize the superiority of the elite and assign to them the task of choosing what goods they consume, what products are available, and so on. The fundamental driving force is paternalism. It's an attempt to do good for other people. Now, interestingly enough, the other source of the modern welfare state comes from a very different yet not wholly unrelated tradition. It comes from Bismarck's Germany. Bismarck's Germany, as it was established in the late 19th century, was a centralized bureaucratic state, and it was the first modern state which introduced on a fairly large scale the kind of welfare measures that have become common in most societies in the modern day. The movement toward a welfare state in its modern form, dates in Great Britain back to the early decades of the 20th century. It was already before World War I that in small measures Britain started down the path of introducing governmental provision for one contingency after another. What ultimately came to be known as cradle to the grave had its start in the early 1900s, in the main with measures for governmental provision for the old and for the mentally deficient. It was followed by Sweden in the 1920s and 30s. Many of you will have remembered a very famous book called The Middle Way, which told about how Sweden was establishing a new, different means. The welfare state came to the United States relatively late. It came to the United States really in any significant form only in the 1930s after the Great Depression and the beginning of the New Deal. Now, the interesting thing is that in every case, the welfare states are in trouble. The United Kingdom has obviously been having great difficulties, social, economic, political. For a while, everybody was saying, but there's Sweden. But now Sweden is in trouble. It is having great difficulties. Its government has changed form, which is a minor matter because the substance hasn't changed, but it has having a good deal of discontent and a great deal of economic difficulty. Denmark is in trouble. The United States, as we have moved farther and farther down the road, we have had more and more dissatisfaction with what has occurred. In the case of the United Kingdom, it is tempting to attribute the problems of the United Kingdom, and many British have done so, to the consequences of World War I and World War II. To say that World War I decimated a whole of a young generation that would have provided the leadership for Britain. And World War II destroyed its economic capacity. And yet, in a great book that was first published in 1899 and of which a revised edition was published in 1913, A.V. Dicey, a famous constitutional lawyer, outlined what was going to happen in Britain in coming decades. In the 1913 edition of his The Relation Between Law and Public Opinion in the 19th Century, Dicey already saw what was going to happen from the developments that were going on. He dated the turn in Britain back in the 1880s and 1890s, the turn from individualism to collectivism. And he discussed what were going to be the far-reaching consequences of the changed role that was being assigned to the state vis-a-vis the individual. And if you read that preface, that 1913 preface, there is nothing that has happened from that day to this that was not pretty clearly foreshadowed, so that it wasn't the war. In any event, Sweden is decisive evidence, because if it was the war that caused the problems in the UK, Sweden stayed out of both wars and indeed profited enormously on an economic level from them, and you certainly cannot blame the problems that have been arising in Sweden on the war. The thing about the welfare state is that when you start on this route, everything goes fine. To begin with, you are imposing taxes on 90% of the people, small taxes, and are able to give considerable benefits to 10% of the people. But the problem is that as time goes on, more and more people come in and either express a desire or are given a chance at a part of the proceeds. So you gradually get to the position where 50% of the people are providing benefits to other 50% of the people, and then you ultimately get to the position where 100% of the people are paying taxes in order to provide benefits to 100% of the people. And you are then in that situation, which Frederick Bastiat described so well 150 years ago, when he said that government is that fiction whereby everybody believes he can live at the expense of everybody else. The question remains, however, what goes wrong? Why is it that such noble objectives lead to such disappointing results? After all, the objective of promoting the welfare of the ordinary man, of eliminating poverty and disease, providing security for old age and against mishaps of fortune, those are noble objectives. I do not believe that there is anybody who can regard them as undesirable. Why is it that the attempt to effectuate such noble objectives by using the machinery of government tends to produce results which are so disappointing? In my opinion, the fundamental answer is very simple. Using government to achieve these objectives means trying to do good with someone else's money. And when you try to do good with someone else's money, there are two basic flaws in the process. The first of those is that nobody spends somebody else's money as carefully as he spends his own. And therefore you are going to have waste and ultimately fiscal catastrophe. But the second is that you cannot do good with someone else's money unless you first take it away from them. And therefore, force, coercion, sending a policeman around to pick somebody else's pocket is at the very heart of the welfare state. And the situation becomes one in which bad means corrupt the good intentions. It's when you try to use bad means to achieve good objectives, the end result is likely to be that the badness of means will triumph over the goodness of the objectives. New York City provides a perfect illustration of this point. There is no city in the country that is more welfare state oriented. There is no city in the country, and few in the world, that have so long a list of programs allegedly designed to benefit those in a state of difficulty. Some 5 or 10 years ago, John Kenneth Galbraith, whom I mentioned before, wrote an article about the problems in New York, in the course of which he said that there was no problem New York had which could not be solved by having the government spend more money on it. Since he wrote, the budget of New York has roughly quadrupled, and the problems of which he spoke have gotten worse rather than better. Why? Well, in the first place, if the government spends money on it, somebody else has less money to spend. The government has been spending more money on these problems, but more money has not been spent on these problems. Because the government can get money to spend only by taking it away from somebody else. And since no one spends somebody else's money as carefully as he spends his own, it's not surprising that money spent by governmental officials has produced less satisfactory, less efficient results than if people had been spending their own money. It so happens, of course, that New York has been, from this point of view, fortunate in not having one of those printing presses on which you can turn out green pieces of paper. So that unlike Great Britain, unlike Sweden, and unlike the United States as a whole, the fiscal problems of New York could not be concealed by inflation, by printing money and trying to acquire resources for a time with inflation. In the case of the United Kingdom, that has proved a very fruitful resource and it has enabled Britain to postpone the evil day. But New York, fortunately, had no such recourse, which is why the results showed up more clearly and more sharply. In lieu of a printing press, all New York had were some senators and congressmen to go down to Washington. But given the great burst of sympathy for New York from the rest of the country, those missions to Washington were not uniformly successful. And the result is that on a fiscal level, New York is bankrupt. Whether it calls itself bankrupt or not is largely irrelevant. The fact remains that it is. It is bankrupt, not in spite of, but because of the attempt to do good with other people's money. That's the one of the consequences, a necessary consequence of the welfare state approach. But a second consequence is a loss of freedom. If you use force to effectuate objects, good or bad, there is going to be a loss of freedom. And New York has lost freedom, and New Yorkers have lost freedom in a double sense. The city of New York has lost freedom. The citizens of New York have lost freedom. They may elect a mayor, but he's a figurehead. The actual power in running New York is now in the hands of a commission appointed by the state of New York to supervise the bankrupt city of New York. And the mayor and the elected officials have very little power to do anything. So you have lost freedom in that sense. But the individuals have lost freedom in a more important sense. That the citizens of New York, over that considerable part of their income which is being spent for them by governmental officials, no longer have freedom to dispose of. As individuals, they do not have freedom in the housing area to enter into contracts with their neighbors. Here again, A.V. Dicey, in that preface I referred to before, was enormously prescient and farsighted. And I want to quote for you from his preface. He was talking about a measure to provide for mentally deficient people. State insane asylums, if you want to call them that, or the equivalent. And he wrote, "The Mental Deficiency Act is the first step along a path on which no sane man can decline to enter, but which, if too far pursued, will bring statesmen across difficulties hard to meet without considerable interference with individual liberty." If too far pursued, will bring statesmen across difficulties hard to meet without considerable interference with individual liberty. You are all aware of how depressingly true those words have become in the case of Russia. He talked about mental deficiency acts. And Russia has now been using insane asylums or their equivalent as a way of disciplining dissidents. Anybody who is a dissident is obviously suffering from a disease of being antisocial, and he must be cured by being placed in a hospital where he can get appropriate shock and other treatment from so-called psychiatrists. And what's true in the case of the Mental Deficiency Act applies equally in respect of other measures. If we assign to others the task of taking care of us, we cannot retain our freedom to pursue our own lives as we would. Now let me turn from this general analysis to a more detailed analysis of why it is that the welfare state measures have so almost invariably disappointed their well-meaning sponsors. If you ask anybody people who call themselves liberals, although that is a term I do not myself wish to apply to them. I am a liberal. I believe in freedom. Liberalism means of and belonging to freedom, pertaining to freedom. Those people who now call themselves liberals have misappropriated the term, because for them it simply means that they are liberal with other people's money. But suppose you ask one of those people who styles himself a modern liberal, what do you think about public housing? Do you think that was a good program? Oh, he'll say, that program had some bad features. We had those wonderful houses in St. Louis, the Pruitt-Igoe houses. We had to blow them up. We have, in the course of public housing, torn down more dwelling units than we have put up. In every city and state of the country, public housing units have become a source of crime and indigence. They have done harm. I remember very, very well a personal episode along these lines when quite some years ago, I was in Los Angeles, not long after the Watts riots. And I went down I had a guided tour through the Watts area of Los Angeles. And the man who was guiding me was a wonderful fella who was in charge of a project sponsored by a trade union for self-help for the people in Watts. And I said to him, well, there are some houses over there. They look pretty good, those dwelling units, those apartments. And he said to me, that's the worst thing that ever happened to Watts, he said. Those are public housing. And then he went on. And he said, do you suppose it really helps the youngsters in Watts to segregate all those who are poor in one place, to take all the divided families? Because after all, a large fraction of the poor come from those in which the family is broken up. So you have all the children with only one parent, and their parents all put together in the one building, and they have only one another to work with. That's terrible. We need to have a very different kind of a setup. Well, what he said is right. Wherever it's been used, public housing has been a disaster. But if you ask the proponents of it, people who have been proponents of it in the past, they will agree. But then they will say, but that's because we didn't do it right. We ought to spend more money on it. We ought to have scattered public housing instead of concentrated. Or we ought to have this, that, or the other thing. And over again, you will find that the reaction is, what we've done in the past has not worked, but that's because we haven't done it right. We ought to spend more money on it. I can understand that attitude in the 1930s, the 1940s, when we were starting in this country on the road, and when we had not sufficiently absorbed the experience of other countries. But it is much harder to understand in the 1970s, when we now have 40 years of experience behind us, and we have seen exactly the same thing happen in area after area after area. Doesn't the time come when we have to say, it's not the particular program, it's the system that's wrong? Well, why is the system wrong? Fundamentally, it's because the laws of the market work as well in the political arena as they work in the economic arena. We have all of us had a tendency to look at economic organization and political organization in very different ways. When we come to the economy, as economists, political scientists, or whatnot, we say, well, it has laws of its own. We ask, if you change this, what will happen? And we say, of course, we will treat people in the market as pursuing their own interest. The worker will try to get the highest wage, the consumer will try to get the lowest price, the employer will try to get the best deal, the producer will try to make the most profit. But then when we come to the political arena, we tend to look at it a little differently. We tend to say, well, now let's figure out what would be the right thing to do from the social point of view. Let's persuade our fellows to vote for it, and once we've voted for it, we'll have the results we want. But surely, we have to look at it from a different point of view. We have to say that people who are in the political arena are also people. They are also trying to do what's best for themselves. The politicians are in business. They are trying to maximize the number of votes they get, or maybe not the number of votes, but they're trying to act in such a way as to get enough votes to get elected. The bureaucrats, I don't mean that in any invidious way. I'll come and become more invidious about them later, but at the moment I don't want to start that way. You or I as a bureaucrat, if we're in that position, we're going to pursue our own interests. Now, in saying that we pursue our own interests, they don't have to be narrow interests. The great martyrs in the world have pursued their own interests as they have seen it. But everybody is going to pursue his own interest. As a great friend of mine, an economist at UCLA, Army Alchin, always says, there's one thing you can depend on everybody else to do. You can absolutely depend on him. You can always depend on him to put his interest ahead of yours. So, if we're going to analyze the political arena, we have to look at that as a different kind of a market in which there is also competition. If the government is going to distribute $1 million for whatever program, no matter how, it will pay people to spend up to $100 million to get it to go to them instead of somebody else. If goodies are going to be distributed, well, then you better go out and try to get your share of the goodies. If you have a perfectly operating market, if you have what we economists call equilibrium, you will end up just as equilibrium in the economic market leads to zero profits, so equilibrium in the political market leads to no net gain to anybody. Because you're going to distribute $1 million, people spend $1 million to get it, you're back where you started from. This is not a fanciful view. And let me give you a couple of very simple examples which aren't strictly in the welfare state area, but in which the same principle applies. Consider the issuance of TV and radio licenses. If you can manage to get the FCC to grant you a license for a TV station, under the law you will pay nothing for it directly to the FCC. That license will immediately be worth a considerable number of millions of dollars. We could name some fortunes in this country that have derived from that, and some of the names would even be known to you. Now, given that that's the process, it pays you. If you're interested in getting it to one of these free grants, so-called free grant, it pays you to devote a lot of effort and energy and money to making sure you get it instead of somebody else. And so you will go in for a big publicity campaign. You will wine and dine the appropriate legislators. You will see if there is some way in which you can indirectly get influence on the commissioners. You may put on a big program of getting public opinion polls, of developing a fancy package, and so on. You can see what happens. You spend money. And not only you spend money, there's only one of these going to be distributed, but it'll pay 10, 100 people to spend some money in order to try to get it. And on the average, it will pay the whole of them to spend as much money in total as the value of the TV license once distributed. Nobody has any net benefit, no benefit from that program. You take the case of urban renewal legislation. If you have urban renewal, first of all, it will pay you to try to influence and spend money on influencing the legislature to have the particular area where you've got some property you'd like to get rid of included in the urban renewal area. And I may say, in this game, there are universities, some of which I have been associated with, which have not been innocent of playing this game. Once the urban renewal legislation is passed, it will pay you to bid among one another to get the property which is going to be taken over. So that the first proposition is that if you are going to spend somebody else's money is going to be spent, there will be many claimants for it, and not only those to whom the well-meaning people initially intended it to go. In the second place, in this competitive game, who are the most efficient competitors? Is it the poor suckers at the bottom who haven't got any money? There may be no direct and close relationship between ability to compete in the political arena and ability to compete in the economic arena, but they're not wholly unrelated. Those people who have not had the qualities which enable them to succeed in the economic arena are not likely to have the qualities that will enable them to succeed in the political arena. There has been the great fear over the centuries of democracy on the ground that the have-nots would get together against the haves, that the bottom 51% would get together in a majority rule and despoil the top 49%. That fear has proved unjustified, and for very good reason. It's not a sensible coalition. If you're organizing an electoral coalition, that's a silly way to organize it. What you want to do is you want to leave out the top 5%, because the money you can take from them is more important than the votes they can provide. You want to leave out the bottom 44%, because, first of all, they're likely to be more easily duped with respect to providing them with your votes, but they aren't likely to be very efficient, good competitors. And then you form a coalition of the 51% in between and benefit that 51% at the expense of the people at the very top and of the people at the very bottom. A colleague of mine, George Stigler, in writing an article on this subject, called this proposition director's law, after another associate or relative of mine, my brother-in-law, Aaron Director, who first developed this idea that this was what you would expect to happen. Now, that's an oversimplified picture, because, of course, the 51% doesn't become a single coalition in the middle. It's made up of lots of little minorities. We talk about being guided by majority rule, but we're not. And yet we are. We are controlled, we are run in a political system, you are run by a majority, which is composed of a coalition of minorities. You get 5% who feel very strongly on one issue and are willing to give up their vote on that issue, forget about everything else. You get another 5%, another 5%, and if you want to get elected to office, if any of you in this room have political ambitions, the way to get elected to office is to figure out how you can construct a coalition of enough 5% so you get 51%. That's why special interests are so powerful and get their way. Of course, over and beyond the concentrated minorities who will get their way in the political process, you have another group that develops as the welfare state grows, that becomes increasingly important. And these are the government officials, elected and unelected. This applies to the welfare measures, but of course it applies to many other issues. You now have, for example, a newly established Department of Energy, which has 19,000 employees, which has contracts with contractors who employ another 100,000 people. So you now have 119,000 people who are being paid to devote a large part of their energy to getting government more and more deeply involved in the problem of production, distribution, and consumption of energy. But the same thing is true in the welfare area. Some years back, when Patrick Moynihan was not a senator of the state of New York, but was an advisor to President Nixon, he was responsible for trying to get through Congress a welfare reform program called the Family Assistance Plan, form of the negative income tax, a program not very dissimilar to the one which President Carter has now said he's going to try to get through. Moynihan failed. He wrote a book about that failure, and it's a fascinating book. Why did he fail? Well, there are a number of reasons, but one of the most important to which he refers was a welfare establishment. Enacting that law would have put out of business a lot of people who had nice jobs, exerting real influence in administering one or another welfare program, because this would have been a substitute for AFDC, for food stamps, for a half a dozen other programs. Now, again, don't misunderstand me. None of these I'm not saying these members of the welfare establishment opposed it. out of a deliberate malice or with the belief that they were doing harm. Not at all. But everybody is perfectly capable of persuading himself that what's in his interest is in the nation's interest. And the bureaucrats, here I am, I'm running a bureau. We're doing good work. We're doing important things. You mean to say you're going to put me out of business? That's not the way to improve the national welfare. And so you get a concentrated group of governmental bureaucrats who make it more and more difficult to follow policies which are in the general interest if they tend to conflict with their own bureaucratic interest. Let me go from this general level of analysis and get down to specific cases. Let me first give you some numbers to show you that I'm not making up the problem I'm talking about. We have had an enormous number of welfare measures passed over the past 50 years in the name of helping the poor. The total expenditures on all these programs, the total expenditures by the federal, the state, and the local governments, excluding private expenditures, excluding private charity and the rest, total governmental expenditures amount today to 1/7 of the national income. The government, to put this in terms that are more meaningful, the government publishes figures on the number of people who are regarded as being in poverty. Now, I warn you, that's a wholly arbitrary number. These levels that divide people between the not poor and the poor are arbitrary, but take them for what they are. The government estimates something like 12% of the people are in what they call low-income status or are poverty. Suppose I divide the total amount of money spent on these programs by the number of people labeled poor. The answer comes out to $9,000 per person, or $36,000 per family of four, to take the mythical family of four so much beloved by statisticians. Compare this with the average per capita income of everybody. The per capita income, per person income of all the people in the United States, after taking away taxes, disposable income, is $6,500. If that $9,000 per person were really going to the poor, they'd be among the rich. That income given to them would put them in the top 20% of the income distribution. But of course it isn't going to the poor. It's going to you and me. It's going to the governmental officials. It's going to the various programs that are enacted in the name of helping the poor, but end up helping you and me. Let me get closer to home and go away from these numbers. Consider one of the major programs, which in a way is not really a social welfare program, but yet it illustrates the general point so beautifully that I can't resist referring to it. And moreover, it applies to you and me. I have in mind governmental expenditures in higher education. Now, Rochester, being a private institution like the University of Chicago, is less guilty than most others. The worst cases are the state universities. But we, all of us, have our hands in the federal pot, and if not in the federal pot, in the state pot. But consider the situation of higher education. You have a great deal of tax money being spent on higher education. Who benefits? Primarily the people who go to the institutions of higher education, the students. Where do they come from? They come disproportionately from the upper income classes. Even those of them who come from the lower income classes, as I myself did, are going to be converted by their college education in large part and by their own qualities into people in the upper income class. Those individuals from low income families who have the ability and the energy and the drive to go to college are the richer ones of the low income class. They are the ones who have personal wealth, personal qualities. In any event, the facts are clear. Graduates of college are on the average a very much higher income class than people who don't go to college. So what do? We impose taxes on everybody, including those who don't go to college. in order to subsidize the people who do go to college. As I say, when I want to be demagogic, we impose taxes on the people in Watts to send the children from Beverly Hills to college. That's a literally exact statement. There's no, it's put demagogically, but the facts are literal. A study in the state of California some years back showed that 50% of the students at the state universities of higher education came from the top 25% of the income scale, and 5% came from the bottom 25%. What's true there is true everywhere. There is no social program in this country, in my opinion, which is so clearly a case of imposing taxes on low-income groups to benefit high-income groups as government subsidies to higher education. Clearly a case of this middle coalition taxing the poor and the very rich to benefit themselves. Now that case is dramatic and shows these forces at work, and it also shows how hard it is to do anything about it. How many people in this room, how many of my colleagues at the various universities I've been, or your fellow students, are going to go out tomorrow and campaign for cutting down government expenditures on higher education? How often do you hear people in colleges, universities, or graduates of college and universities who will scream their head off about how we must have equality and down with regressive taxes, and we have to tax the rich and help the poor? How many of them have you heard denounce this utterly unconscionable program of imposing taxes on the poor to send people who are going to be well-to-do to college? Why not? Because we know that what's good for us is good for the country. I think it's a good thing that everybody should have an opportunity to go to college, if he has the will, the capacity to do so, provided he's willing to pay for it himself. If he can't do it in advance, fine, let's set up mechanisms whereby we can finance him through college in return for a commitment on his part to pay it back later. And we can go into details about the form and so on. I'm just trying to get at the principle of the thing. Let me give you some other examples. A major one of these programs, the most expensive, is Social Security. Now, Social Security is a case, as you may know, and it's one of the most extreme cases of misleading advertising that I know of. It's not social, and it's not security. What it is a combination of a bad tax and a bad relief program, a bad distributive program. It is sold as if individuals who pay Social Security taxes are paying for their own benefits that they're going to get later on. That's the language in which the Social Security Administration sells it. That's extremely misleading. What's happening is that people today are paying taxes on their wages. People today are receiving payments from the government. The relation between the taxes Mr. X pays and the benefits to which he is entitled is very, very slight. There is a tiny bit of a relationship to maintain this fiction. But on the whole, there's very little relationship. Two people who pay the same amount of money and through their lives may get very different benefits. But let's leave that aside. I want to go to the point I'm talking about the tendency for us, and for those of us in the middle class, to impose programs that benefit us at the expense of people below us. Social Security does involve a very large transfer from the young to the old. That is, today's young pay taxes, which go to pay benefits to the old. But over and above that, it involves a very substantial transfer from low-income groups to middle-income groups. How come? Well, consider. At what age does a young man or young woman from the lower-income groups go to work? 16, 17, 18. He or she will start to pay Social Security taxes at that time. At what time do we go to work, or do our children go to work? You and they stay protected in schools, stay at college. They generally start to work at 24 or 25 maybe, and then they start to pay taxes. If you do a little actuarial calculation, as nowadays you can all do on one of those handy Hewlett-Packard calculators, you will discover that the effect of this is to make the total payments of those who start early about a third higher in actuarial value than the payments of those who start later. But that's only half the story. Have you ever looked at the statistics of average length of life? Who do you suppose has a longer expected length of life, those in the lower income groups or those in the higher income groups? Those in the higher income groups. As a consequence, those of us in the middle and upper income groups pay less taxes because we start paying later, and we get more benefits because we live longer, with the end result that you have a program enacted in the name of helping the poor and keeping the poor out of the poorhouse, which has the effect of benefiting middle-income groups at the expense of relatively low-income groups. Now, over and above that, there are lots of inequities. There are lots of people in the middle-income groups who don't benefit, some in the low who do. I'm not saying there isn't. It's an enormously complicated program, and there are many different considerations. But taken as a whole, it's a marvelous illustration of the tendency for legislation enacted in the name of helping the poor to turn out to be a way in which middle-income people help themselves. The only program I know of for which a good case can be made that the people who get the money have lower average incomes than the people who pay the taxes. The only program I know of is direct welfare, AFDC and direct welfare. And it's not an accident that that's the program which draws the greatest opposition and to which there is the greatest discontent on the part of the population as a whole. Now, it is a lousy program, I agree. So are all the others. It's no worse than the others. It is. There is a welfare mess, and I have, as you may know, long been in favor of major reforms of the welfare program, of substituting a negative income tax for the whole collection of programs. But my point is that that's the only one I know of, and it's only a small fraction of the total expenditures on program labeled as being for poverty. Over and above the waste of resources through these welfare state measures, they have further effects which I think are very serious from the point of view of the maintenance of a free society. In the first place, calling on the government to solve problems strains that social fabric of agreement on basic values that is necessary to maintain a stable society. In order to have any kind of a stable society, you have to have people agree with one another. You have to have them have a certain minimum common set of values and beliefs. And you want to avoid straining that set of beliefs. Now, the great virtue of the market is that people who hate one another in other respects can cooperate with one another on the market without any difficulty. As I often say, when you buy bread at the grocery, you don't know whether the wheat from which that came was grown by a black or a white, an Indian or a Chinaman, Mohammedan, a Christian, a Jew, somebody you like, somebody you dislike. And it doesn't make a darn bit of difference. And even though you and he disagree violently on every issue, you can cooperate. He can produce the wheat and you can buy the bread. That's the great virtue of the market, that it permits cooperation without conformity, without people having to agree with one another. Political mechanisms have the opposite arrangement. You have to enforce conformity on people. You have to decide on the standards. You have to decide on who is going to pay, who is going to get. And when 51% of the people say one thing and 49% say the other, 100% do what the 51% say. As a result, the more you have to use political mechanisms, the more you tend to strain the social fabric. And this has shown up very drastically. This is a reason why you can go much farther in this direction in homogeneous societies like Sweden than you can in heterogeneous societies like our own. But it's showing up in the form of divisiveness, of the tendency of things like the tendency for Quebec to try to get independence, for Scotland to try to become separate. After all, if the government's going to handle the oil, the Scots want to have their hands in the oil pot. So that one of the effects of resort to welfare state measures is to promote regionalism and divisions within our society. In the United States, this is shown up by the growth of ethnic particularism, ethnic divisiveness. We used to be proud of being a melting pot in which we got a common set of values while each of us was able to go our own way with respect to our local customs and our local backgrounds. But now that there is a great deal to be gained by forming cohesive minority blocs, political entrepreneurs are out forming blocs of people from particular ethnic backgrounds, and they are now going to become more cohesive blocs, which tends to divide the society. The welfare state measures develop an acceptance on the part of the public at large of regimentation. It develops it on the part of the poor, who get their benefits by being told what to do. I remember years ago a fellow who was doing a study of the welfare programs in New York City came to me, and he said, "I've been reading your book, Capitalism and Freedom," he said, "and you talk about the conflict between growth of government and human freedom." And he says, "You don't know what you're talking about." He says, "You don't have your freedom interfered with very much. If you really want to see this conflict in action, you go down to Harlem and you look at the people who are on welfare. They can't move from one place to another without getting the permission of their welfare supervisor. They can't put in a telephone without getting it approved, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They are the people who are having their lives regimented." Well, it's not only they. Those of us who are subject to Medicare have to know about the forms we have to fill out. Those of you who are students who are getting federal aid or loans or whatnot know about the conditions to which you have to subscribe. All of us who know that our future benefits are going to come from the government have to think three times before we engage in actions that might prejudice our future acceptability. So the effect of the growth of the welfare state is also to develop an acceptance of regimentation. Furthermore, it undermines the ethical and moral standards of the people. It undermines those standards by instilling the notion that nobody is responsible for himself, that if something is wrong, somebody else is responsible for it. Now, of course, what happens to people is not wholly a result of their own behavior or their own actions. Society does have an effect. Outside forces do affect them. But unless you adopt broadly the view that individuals are to be responsible for themselves, you cannot get, in my opinion, a decent free society. Well, we are fast, in my view, approaching the kind of situation that Dicey outlined, in which we must be fearful about the extent to which the growth of the welfare state is encroaching on our freedom, encroaching on it indirectly by its fiscal effects, by putting us in a situation where the fiscal crisis that it tends to produce, as in Britain, as in New York City, interferes with our freedom. Interfering with our freedom through the extent to which we become subject to bureaucratic control. What can we do about it? Well, obviously, the right way to do it would be to get rid of these social welfare measures and promote our basic objectives by other means. In getting rid of these welfare measures, we cannot abandon them overnight. We have induced millions of people to become dependent on them. We would have to get rid of them gradually. That's why I have always been in favor of introducing a negative income tax as a substitute for a great many of them, as providing a way in which you could gradually get out. But I have to admit that that's a romantic approach. and is inconsistent with everything I've been saying tonight. Because it goes back to the idea that the way you attack government is by trying to figure out the right answers, persuading people, and getting it legislated. And we know that isn't the way government works. What we need to do is to look at an objective analysis of the forces set in motion that may lead to a reversal. And there are forces set in motion, very strong forces. Because as the welfare state moves and grows, you get bigger and bigger taxes with fewer and fewer benefits. And people don't like to pay the taxes without getting the benefits. And therefore, the objective circumstances develop under which you can have a tax revolt. You have seen that, and I think that Great Britain may be giving us a very favorable example from that point of view. Here you have a situation in Great Britain. Great Britain went much farther than we did. In the United States, total government spending at all levels has gone to 40% of our income. In Great Britain, it went up to 60% of their income. Great Britain had a much more severe financial crisis than we did. Its inflation reached something like 25% a year instead of ours just a mere 12% a year. Great Britain has, as a result, had enormous pressure on its political system. And the Labour government of Great Britain in the past 2 years, for example, has behaved in a way to reduce the ratio of government spending to income and to reduce the welfare measures. So I think that there is some chance. And that chance, I think, derives from the impact of two things: the inefficiency of government, which causes discontent with government policies, and the burden of taxes, which cause a tax revolt. In thinking ahead to alternatives, I want to close on a different note. The objectives of those well-meaning people who were behind the development of the welfare state are good objectives, and we must not denigrate them or lose sight of them. What is needed is a recognition that there are other ways of promoting those objectives than the use of force and the use of government. There is a strong tendency to believe that you either must have the government do it, or else at the other end you have only narrowly defined market activities with everybody looking after himself. That's wrong. There is a great middle ground. There is a great area in which you can have voluntary activity by individuals who cooperate with one another for common purposes. That is what we have always had. The 19th century in the United States, when government spending never reached more than 10% of the national income and federal government spending never reached more than 3%, when we had essentially no welfare state measures on the federal level, certainly, and few on the state level, was the period, that 19th century was a period of the greatest outburst of eleemosynary charitable activity that the world has ever seen. You had the great development of non-profit hospitals. You had the foreign missions. And you had the establishment of great universities like this one. The market is an effective means for voluntary contribution in promoting charitable activities as well as all other activities. And in trying to reduce the role of government, one of the worst things, in my opinion, that has happened as a result of the welfare state is the destruction of private mechanisms. What we need to do is to strengthen those and use those instead of the compulsory mechanisms of the state. Thank you.